The conductor stood backstage, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his jacket. The bright lights of the television set, the hum of the audience settling in their seats, and the soft murmur of conversation from the orchestra were all part of the atmosphere that had been building for weeks. This was his moment. He was no stranger to the grand stage, and yet tonight felt different. For years he had been the one to stand in front of orchestras, leading them with an iron fist. His hands, precise and calculated, guided the musicians through complex pieces. His face, stern and focused, rarely showed any emotion. Every note, every pause, every movement was carefully orchestrated to create the perfect performance. He was known for his perfectionism and his ability to make any orchestra sound like a world-class ensemble. To most, he was the standard by which all conductors were measured. Tonight, however, was not just another performance. This was different. The show was live, broadcast to millions of people. It was a high-stakes competition, and every musician knew what was on the line. The winner would take home a prize that could change the trajectory of their career. The conductor was here not just to perform, but to show the world his brilliance, to remind everyone why he was at the top of his field. Backstage, he tried to shake off any nerves. His reputation was built on his ability to control every aspect of the performance, to be the undisputed leader of the orchestra. He'd spent decades honing his craft, learning the ins and outs of every instrument, understanding how each player's unique sound fit into the greater symphony. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: the unexpected. As he walked to the front of the stage, he saw the orchestra already in place. The musicians were tuning their instruments, exchanging quiet words. But then his eyes fell on them, the twins. Two young women, both playing classical instruments, both seemingly no older than teenagers. The conductor had heard of them. Their names had been popping up everywhere lately, in every newspaper and music magazine. The twins were musical prodigies, known for their unconventional approach to classical music. They had made waves with their performances, blending traditional sounds with a modern twist, pushing boundaries in a way that left critics both impressed and unsettled. But here, on this stage, in front of a live audience, he was the one in control. His reputation was built on strict precision, and he wasn't about to let two young musicians change that. He took his place at the podium, raised his baton, and nodded to the orchestra. The music began, flowing smoothly at first, just as he had planned. The conductor led the orchestra with his usual confidence, his hands moving in flawless motions that guided the musicians through each note. The audience was silent, their eyes fixed on the performance. The conductor felt the familiar rush of control, the power that came from leading such a large group of talented musicians. But then, something unexpected happened. As the music reached a more complex section, the twins, sitting at the back of the orchestra, began to play in a way that was different from the conductor's strict interpretation. One of the twins, playing the violin, added a slight flourish to her part, an extra note here, a delicate shift in timing there. It was subtle, but enough for the conductor to notice. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. They were talented, after all. Maybe they were just experimenting. He continued to lead the orchestra with his usual precision, but it became clear that the twins weren't following his cues in the way the other musicians were. The violinist played a bit faster, and her twin, playing the piano, followed her lead without hesitation. The conductor frowned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had spent hours rehearsing with the orchestra, ensuring every part was aligned, every movement in sync. But now the twins were creating a musical conversation between themselves, and it was taking the piece in an entirely new direction. As the performance progressed, the twins' improvisations became more daring. They weren't playing the piece exactly as it had been written. Instead, they were adding their own touch, taking liberties that made the music feel free-flowing, almost like a jam session rather than a carefully structured performance. The conductor felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't what he had planned. This wasn't how classical music was meant to be performed. There were rules, traditions, and he prided himself on following them to the letter. But the twins were ignoring these unwritten rules with every note they played. Still, he tried to remain composed. He tightened his grip on the baton, focused on the orchestra, and made a deliberate motion to bring them back to the original tempo. His eyes briefly flicked toward the twins, silently commanding them to fall in line. They seemed to sense his disapproval, But instead of backing down, they responded with even more creativity. The violinist's fingers danced across the strings, her movements so fluid it seemed like she was barely touching the instrument. The pianist, her twin, mirrored the same freedom, her hands effortlessly gliding over the keys in a way that was almost magical. The orchestra, caught in the twins' spontaneous energy, began to shift. The musicians started to follow the twins' lead, hesitating less and less. Some of them smiled, enjoying the fresh air the twins brought to the performance. It was as if a weight had been lifted. The conductor, however, felt the grip of control slipping through his fingers. He attempted to bring the orchestra back into sync with a sharp, commanding motion of his baton. But instead of following his direction, the orchestra seemed to gravitate toward the twins' playful rhythms. The conductor's frustration grew, but so did his curiosity. There was something undeniably captivating about the twins' approach. It wasn't just their technical skill. It was the freedom they brought to the music, the way they made it feel alive, unpredictable, and real. It was the kind of energy that the conductor, in all his years of experience, had never quite embraced. By the time the performance reached its final movement, the conductor found himself standing there, unable to fully regain control. The music, once rigid and precise, had transformed into something else, a spontaneous, flowing creation. The audience, who had been silent at first, was now leaning forward, captivated by the unusual but beautiful performance unfolding before them. The conductor, despite his initial resistance, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. As the final notes echoed through the theater, the orchestra slowly brought the piece to a close. The conductor lowered his baton, his mind racing. The performance had been different. Not what he had planned, but still powerful. The applause from the audience was deafening, and he stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. The twins had done something unexpected, something that pushed him out of his comfort zone. It was clear that they had outplayed him, not in terms of technique or skill, but in their ability to bring something fresh and untamed to the music. They had shown him that there was more to music than just precision. There was also creativity, risk, and a kind of freedom that could not be controlled. As the orchestra filed off stage, the conductor remained behind for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. The twins had changed the rules, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he had the answers anymore. The conductor's heart was still racing as he walked off the stage, the sound of applause still echoing in his ears. He had expected to leave with a sense of triumph, but instead he felt unsettled. There was something about the twins, their freedom, their audacity, that had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Backstage, he found himself standing in front of the dressing room mirror, staring at his own reflection. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of a performance, to ensure that every note was played exactly as it was meant to be. But tonight the music had slipped through his fingers. The twins had made him feel out of control, and that was something he could not allow. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a soft knock on the door. Before he could answer, the door creaked open and one of the twins stepped inside. She was the violinist, her long black hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She looked at him with a smile that was both warm and a little mischievous, as if she already knew exactly what he was thinking. "That was an interesting performance," she said, her voice light and playful. "You looked like you were in a bit of a hurry to finish, though." The conductor's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure whether to be irritated or impressed by her casual tone. "I don't appreciate how you deviated from the score," he replied coldly, trying to maintain his composure. "Music is about precision. Without it, everything falls apart." The twin tilted her head slightly, her smile never fading. "We were just trying to bring something new to it. You know, music isn't just about following rules. It's about feeling the moment. It's about playing what comes to you, not just what's written on the page." He scoffed, crossing his arms. "You can't just abandon structure. There's a reason composers wrote things down the way they did. The music is meant to be performed a certain way. Maybe," she said softly, her gaze steady, "but maybe it's also meant to be interpreted, to change with the times. Don't you ever wonder if there's more to it than just repeating what's already been done?" Her words hung in the air, challenging him in a way no one had ever dared before. The conductor opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped. He had always believed that music was about discipline, about perfecting the craft. But something about the way she spoke, the way she played, made him question that belief, even if only for a moment. Before he could say anything, she turned to leave, but not without one last comment. You know, we don't have to agree on everything, but I think you'll find that there's more to music than just control. Maybe one day you'll understand. And with that, she was gone. The conductor stood there for a long time, his reflection staring back at him, as if questioning his very purpose. He had spent his life creating flawless performances, making sure everything was in its right place, perfectly timed. But the twins, with their wild energy and unexpected creativity, had turned everything he knew upside down. He wasn't sure if he was angry or amazed. The next day, the orchestra gathered again for rehearsal. The conductor stood at the front, his back straight, his face as impassive as ever. He couldn't afford to let his frustration show. This was his moment to regain control. The show was still ongoing, and there was a prize to be won. His reputation was on the line, but as soon as the twins sat down at their instruments, something shifted. The conductor could feel it in the air. The tension, the uncertainty. He knew what was coming. The violinist glanced at her twin, who nodded slightly. And then, without warning, they were off. The conductor raised his baton, but this time he was prepared. He wasn't going to let them lead the orchestra off track again. He signaled the musicians to start, his movements sharp and deliberate. The orchestra followed him, their instruments filling the room with sound. But then, just as before, the twins began to play in a way that didn't fit with his vision. The violinist added an embellishment to her part, a quick trill that had not been in the score. The pianist mirrored her, her fingers moving faster, playing with an intensity that made the rest of the orchestra hesitate. The conductor's eyes narrowed. He flicked his baton, signaling for them to stop. The music abruptly halted, the sound of instruments dying away in the silence. "That's not how we're going to play this," he said firmly, his voice colder than before. "We're sticking to the score. No more improvisations." The twins exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment the conductor thought they would push back. But instead the violinist gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll play it your way." But as they began again, the same problem arose. The twins couldn't help themselves. The music was too much a part of them to ignore. Their fingers seemed to find new rhythms, new interpretations even when they were supposed to be following the conductor's lead. Their eyes locked on each other, communicating without words, their instruments telling a story that no sheet of music could contain. The conductor's frustration grew. How could they be so confident, so carefree, when everything he had done in his career was about following the rules? What made them think they could just throw caution to the wind? He wanted to stop them, to demand they fall in line, but he knew that if he did, the performance would fall apart. The rest of the orchestra was already beginning to follow the twins' lead, their playing becoming more free and less rigid. The conductor clenched his fists around the baton, the muscles in his arms tense with anger. He raised his hand to bring the orchestra back in sync, but then stopped. He watched as the twins played on, the music taking on a life of its own. It wasn't perfect, not by the conductor's standards, but there was something about it, something raw and alive. For a moment he just stood there, his mind racing. He couldn't deny it anymore. The twins had something he didn't have, something he couldn't control. He could feel the audience's energy shifting too. They weren't just listening to a performance, they were experiencing it. The rest of the rehearsal continued in this strange, uncomfortable tension. The twins played with the freedom of artists, while the conductor tried to hold on to his vision of order and control. But no matter how hard he tried, the music wouldn't bend to his will. That night, after the rehearsal ended, the conductor found himself alone in his dressing room again, staring out the window into the darkening sky. He had spent so many years making sure everything was perfect, ensuring that every note was in its right place. But the twins had shown him something new. Music wasn't just about precision. It was also about expression, about breaking free from the rules and letting the music flow. He didn't know what to make of it yet, but one thing was clear. The twins had changed everything, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to accept that. The night of the live performance arrived, and the air was thick with excitement. The theater was packed with an eager audience, the kind of crowd that only came for the biggest events. People who appreciated the finer things in life, who understood music not just as sound, but as an experience. The orchestra had been rehearsing for weeks, and tonight, they were all set to showcase their skills in front of millions of viewers. Backstage, the conductor stood tall, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium, his mind sharp. He had been through countless performances in his career, but this was different. This was the one that could define his legacy. He couldn't afford to let the twins' impromptu style ruin everything. He had worked too hard, too long for this moment. The twins, on the other hand, were calm, almost too calm. They weren't nervous. Their confidence was almost unsettling. They had practiced their parts, of course, but they also knew they were going to add their own touch, something they hadn't discussed with the conductor. The violinist and pianist exchanged a brief, knowing glance, and that was enough. They didn't need to talk. They understood each other completely. Their bond forged over years of playing together, of pushing each other to be better. As the orchestra took their places on stage, the conductor stepped forward. The bright stage lights warmed his face, but the sweat on his brow wasn't from the heat. It was from the pressure, the weight of leading the entire orchestra in front of a global audience. His hands were steady as he raised the baton, and the first notes of the piece filled the theater. The music began with precision, exactly as it had been rehearsed. The conductor's movements were sharp, deliberate. His eyes scanned the orchestra, watching every musician to make sure they followed his lead. The piece was elegant, a perfect showcase for the orchestra's skill. But there was something different in the air tonight. The tension from the rehearsals hadn't gone away. In fact, it seemed to hang over the performance like a cloud. When the twins began to play, the conductor was ready. He had prepared himself to keep them in check, to make sure they stuck to the score. He had been clear about his expectations. But as soon as their instruments came to life, the same thing happened again. The violinist added a subtle, almost imperceptible variation in her timing, a slight change in rhythm that wasn't in the score. The pianist responded instantly, her fingers dancing over the keys in a way that didn't match the conductor's cues. The conductor's jaw tightened. He could feel the shift in the music, the subtle disruption. He tried to rein it in, raising his baton higher to signal the orchestra back on track, but the twins didn't follow. They weren't even looking at him anymore. Their eyes were locked on each other, their fingers guiding the music as if the conductor didn't exist. The orchestra hesitated for a moment, unsure of which direction to follow. The conductor's frustration built, and he waved his baton again, this time with more urgency. He needed to bring them back in line. He couldn't let this go on. The performance was starting to lose its structure, and it was his job to maintain control. But the twins didn't falter. In fact, they seemed to play more freely, more confidently. Their music began to flow in its own direction, something untamed and wild. The violinist's fingers flew across the strings, creating a beautiful, unpredictable melody that the piano mirrored. Together they were creating something unexpected, something that didn't belong on a page of sheet music. It was raw, emotional, and undeniably captivating. The audience began to notice. At first they seemed unsure, perhaps even a little confused. But as the twins continued to play, their music so full of life and passion, the crowd began to respond. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on the twins as if they were watching something magical unfold before them. But the conductor was no longer in control. He could feel it. The orchestra, once obedient and disciplined, was starting to follow the twins' lead. The musicians were listening to the music, not to him. They were being swept up in the energy, the improvisation. The conductor's movements became more desperate as he tried to get the orchestra back on track. But it was clear that his attempts were in vain. For the first time in his career, the conductor realized something he had never considered before. Music wasn't just about the notes on the page. It wasn't just about following the rules. There was a magic to it that couldn't be contained, a spontaneity that couldn't be controlled. The piece, which had started with such precision, now had a life of its own. The twins were leading and the orchestra was following. It was a beautiful chaos, a mix of structure and freedom, of precision and emotion. The conductor's hands fell to his sides, his baton forgotten for the moment. He was no longer leading the performance, he was part of it, just like everyone else. The music had taken over, and he had no choice but to surrender to it. As the music reached its climax, the tension between the conductor and the twins seemed to disappear. They were no longer adversaries. They were musicians, creating something new and beautiful together. The audience, who had been uncertain at first, erupted into applause. They understood. They felt the music. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was alive. The conductor stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with every breath. His mind raced. What had just happened? He had worked his entire career to perfect the art of conducting, to shape the music in his image. But tonight, the twins had shown him that there was something more to music than control. There was freedom, spontaneity, and a kind of connection that couldn't be forced. As the orchestra finished the piece, the conductor lowered his head, accepting the inevitable. The twins had outplayed him, not through better technique or skill, but by embracing the music with their hearts, by allowing it to take them wherever it wanted to go. And in doing so, they had brought out something in the orchestra that he had never been able to reach. The applause continued to roar, but the conductor was silent. He had always believed that a conductor was the one who held the power, the one who shaped the music. But tonight he had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the music itself is the one in charge. As the curtains closed, the conductor stepped off the stage, his mind still reeling. The twins had turned everything he knew about music upside down, and for the first time in years he wasn't sure if he was the one who had won tonight. Backstage after the performance, the conductor stood in front of the mirror again, his reflection barely visible through the haze of his thoughts. The thunderous applause still echoed in his ears, but it felt distant, almost surreal. His hands were trembling slightly as he removed his bow tie and began undoing the buttons on his jacket. He wanted to tell himself that it was just another performance, that it was nothing special, but deep down, he knew the truth. That night, everything had changed. He had lost control. For a man who had spent his entire career in charge, who had defined himself by his ability to lead, it was a humbling realization. The twins had thrown him off course not with their skill or technique, but with their freedom, their willingness to break the rules and let the music speak for itself. The very thing he had fought against for so long, spontaneity, had taken over, and it had created something beautiful, something unexpected. He paced the dressing room, his mind racing. What had happened to him during the performance? Why had he allowed himself to fall into that moment of doubt, of hesitation? His whole life had been built on discipline, on precision, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The sound of footsteps behind him interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see one of the twins standing in the doorway, the violinist. She looked calm, composed, nothing like the energy that had poured from her on stage. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply stood there watching him. Her presence was quiet but strong, almost like she was giving him space to figure things out for himself. Finally, after a long moment of silence, she spoke softly. "You were great out there tonight." He stared at her, unsure of how to respond. "I wasn't great," he said slowly, his voice rough. "I lost control. You and your sister, you changed everything. I couldn't keep up. I tried to lead, but the music, it just wouldn't follow." The violinist smiled gently, as if she had been expecting him to say something like that. "That's the thing," she said, her voice steady but kind. "You didn't lose control. You just let the music lead you for a change." The words hit him harder than he expected. Let the music lead? He had always prided himself on being the one in control, the one who shaped every note, every movement. It was what made him the conductor. It was how he had built his career. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. "I've spent my whole life trying to perfect the craft, to make every performance flawless. I don't know how to just let go. I don't know how to embrace what happened tonight." The violinist nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I understand. It's hard, especially when you've spent so much time in one way of thinking. But music isn't just about perfection. It's about connection. It's about feeling what's happening in the moment. You don't need to control everything to create something beautiful." Her words lingered in the air, challenging him to rethink everything he had believed. The conductor stood still, his mind turning over what she had said. Was it really about connection? Was it really about letting go and allowing the music to breathe on its own? Could he, someone who had built his career on control, ever truly embrace such a different approach? Before he could say anything else, the violinist turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "It's not about being perfect," she said with a small smile. "It's about being real. You'll figure it out, I'm sure of it." With that, she was gone. The conductor sank into the chair behind him, his thoughts swirling. The applause from the audience still rang in his ears, but now, it felt distant. The performance had ended, but his journey was just beginning. He didn't know what had happened to him on stage, but it had stirred something deep inside. A new kind of understanding, one that had nothing to do with control or perfection, but everything to do with the heart of the music itself. Over the next few days, the conductor's mind replayed the performance over and over. He couldn't stop thinking about the twins, about their approach to music. He had spent so long focusing on precision, on getting every detail right. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had missed. The twins hadn't been playing perfectly by traditional standards, but they had played with passion, with freedom. Their music had a raw energy to it that he had never allowed himself to experience. They weren't just following the notes, they were creating something from the inside out. Could he do that? Could he let go of his need for control and just feel the music instead of dictating it? The more he thought about it, the more the idea began to take root. It wasn't an easy thing to accept, but for the first time in his career, he realized that maybe there was more to music than perfect execution. Maybe the spontaneity, the creativity, the risk was what made music truly alive. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about being human, about connecting with the music, with the musicians, and with the audience on a deeper level. The conductor knew that this wasn't something he could change overnight. It would take time, but he also knew that he couldn't ignore the lesson he had learned that night. He had always been the one to lead, but perhaps now it was time to let the music lead him. He spent the next few weeks rethinking his approach to conducting. He practiced, of course, but now he also practiced letting go. At first it was uncomfortable. He would stand in front of the orchestra, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to loosen his grip on control. He still had a long way to go, but little by little he began to embrace the freedom he had once feared. And then one day during rehearsal it happened. As he stood in front of the orchestra leading them through a difficult passage, he felt it. The music taking on a life of its own. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was real. The musicians, instead of waiting for his exact cue, responded to the music, feeling their way through it. And for the first time, the conductor didn't force it. He let the orchestra take the lead, trusting them to find the way. It was a moment of pure magic. The music, the performers, the conductor, it all came together in a way that felt right. The conductor didn't need to control every note. He didn't need to perfect everything. He just needed to let the music unfold, to embrace the unexpected. And when the final note resonated through the hall, he realized something important. He had finally found the connection he had been looking for. Weeks passed since that unforgettable performance, and the conductor felt a subtle but powerful change within himself. The experience had been nothing short of transformative. No longer did he cling so desperately to precision and control, the way he had done for years. It wasn't that he had abandoned his dedication to excellence, far from it. But now he understood that perfection wasn't the only thing that mattered in music. There was something deeper, something that could not be measured by notes or timing. It was a crisp morning, the kind that carried a quiet sense of promise, when he found himself preparing for another live performance. The orchestra had gathered once again, and this time there was no tension, no underlying sense of conflict between him and the musicians. He had spent weeks refining his approach, finding ways to incorporate the freedom he had seen in the twins' performance into his own conducting. The music would still follow structure, still follow his direction, but there would be room for it to breathe, to live. The twins were in their usual spots, twin performers, twin energies, twin spirits that always seemed to flow seamlessly together. The violinist caught his eye as she tuned her instrument, and she gave him a small, knowing smile. He returned it, this time without the slightest trace of the tension that had existed between them before. They didn't need to speak. They knew something had changed. The orchestra began to assemble, their instruments humming with anticipation. The conductor walked to the podium, feeling the familiar weight of the baton in his hand. The audience was waiting. The spotlight felt warm on his face, but this time it didn't feel heavy. As the music began, something remarkable happened. The conductor felt a new kind of trust both in himself and in the orchestra. His hands moved with confidence, but they weren't stiff or rigid. They guided, yes, but they also followed. He wasn't just dictating the performance. He was part of it, letting the musicians move with the music, not simply play it. The twins, especially the violinist, had influenced him more than he had realized. They had shown him that music wasn't just about getting everything right. It was about passion. It was about communication. It was about embracing the unexpected and finding beauty in the unplanned. This time, when the violinist added a flourish to her part, he didn't stop her. Instead, he let the moment unfold. He felt the connection between the performers, the way the music swirled around them, a living thing that they all gave shape to. The pianist followed, adding her own twist, her fingers gliding over the keys like they were part of the same thought. The rest of the orchestra picked up on it too, following the subtle changes in rhythm and tone, responding with an energy they hadn't shown before. There was a perfect moment, a brief but beautiful passage of music where the conductor stepped back, allowing the orchestra to take over. His hands were still in the air, guiding, but he wasn't leading. He was listening, letting the sound wash over him. And in that moment, the music didn't just come from him. It came from everyone, from all the instruments, from the air itself. The audience could feel it too. They could hear the difference in the music, something more alive, more organic, more heartfelt. The performance didn't sound perfect in the traditional sense. It wasn't flawless, but it was beautiful. It was authentic. It was the kind of performance that made people feel something deep inside, the kind of performance that could only happen when the musicians were truly connected to each other and the music itself. As the final notes rang out, the conductor lowered his hands. The orchestra played the last chord, held it just a little longer than usual, and the music faded into the silence. The audience held their breath, waiting, and then the applause erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of a good performance. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who have felt something transformative. They were on their feet, cheering, clapping, shouting their appreciation. The conductor stood motionless for a moment, breathing in the energy of the moment, letting the feeling of it wash over him. He had been part of something bigger than himself. He had finally understood what the twins had been trying to teach him. Music wasn't just about perfect execution. It was about the experience. It was about creating something that resonated deeply with the people who heard it. The orchestra began to file off the stage, but the conductor remained for a moment, soaking in the applause. He could feel the warmth of it, not just from the audience, but from the orchestra itself. The musicians were smiling, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a performance well done. But this time, there was something different in the way they looked at him. They had seen a change in him. They had felt it too. As he walked off stage, he caught sight of the twins. The violinist caught his gaze again, and this time there was no need for words. She simply gave him a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between them. The conductor smiled back, finally understanding what had been eluding him all this time. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about control. It was about the music and about trusting the people around him to create something together. He had spent so long trying to make everything fit neatly into place. But now he knew. Sometimes it was the messiness, the spontaneity, and the heart of the moment that made the music truly magical. As he left the stage, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so many years. The battle between control and freedom, between precision and creativity was over. The music had found its place, and so had he. For the first time in his life, the conductor knew exactly what it meant to be a true leader. It wasn't about taking charge of every note. It was about letting the music lead, letting the people around him shine, and finding a way to make something beautiful together. And with that, he finally realized he wasn't just a conductor. He was part of the music, and that was enough.